My name's Jackie King from King's Automotive, and today we're gonna show you how to get your 991.1 looking like this. We're gonna be installing Techart springs, front and rear. Now that we have the wheel off, which is just 5 19mm lug studs, what we're gonna wanna do is move on to the sway bar link. It's actually going to be an 18mm nut, but on the back of it, there will be a counter hold. The tension on it isn't very strong, so what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna hold it with a plier, and then I'm gonna hit it loose. Slide the nut out, get the sway bar link out of here. It's probably gonna give you some resistance because of the load of the sway bar. What we're gonna do is we're just gonna get a punch and tap it out. Now the sway bar link also serves as the pinch bolt, and one thing you're gonna wanna pay attention to is that the knuckle hasn't slid down past the strut. You can actually see that it started to slide down a little. If you're not paying attention, you could just throw this back on, tighten it, and then you'll be fine. But your car might be like jacked up in height because the spring isn't sitting all the way down. That's something we'll readdress later, and I'll show putting it back in and making sure that it's fully seated. We're gonna move to the top over here. We're gonna disconnect this electrical connector for the PASM, and then we're gonna undo the center nut for the strut, and then the 3 strut mount nuts, and then we're gonna support the bottom with a floor jack, and then we're gonna go from there. We already sort of have this half disassembled. It's literally just 3 plastic pieces that we have to take off. You're gonna wanna take off the big center one first, actually. It literally just clips on, you know, slides in the back over here, and then you got a bunch of clips on the bottom that you can literally just pull up on and it'll lift off easily. Once you take the stuff off, just set them aside. You take off the center piece, we're gonna work on the side piece. Again, it literally just pulls off. Once you pop everything off, you're gonna wanna slide it back, and that's basically it. Now that we have that undone, we can access the PASM connector. There's gonna be a little release tab here. We're just gonna grab our screwdriver, lift off the tab. The connector should pull right out. Move to our floor jack. We're gonna get on the bottom of the suspension over here. You're just gonna wanna support the front suspension's weight, because once we undo the strut mount nut, the spring's going to wanna make it shoot down. So just go until you feel some tension on it, and then we can move on. We're gonna remove the center strut mount nut. It's gonna be a 21 mil. Probably gonna need a pass-through as the strut's going to wanna spin with you. The center counter hold, I use a 10. It feels a little loose. Might even be a 9, but no, it's a 10. It doesn't take much tension anyways. Just make sure this connector isn't flailing around, marking up your paint. Spin the rest of it loose. Take the nut out. Lower the jack now. You'll watch the whole suspension come out from the mount. So yeah, it's gonna come down only just a little. We can get the floor jack out of the way now. We're gonna go back under the car, press down the whole assembly. You're gonna have to push on it pretty hard. What we're trying to do is getting the strut mount to separate from the bearing so we can take out the strut mount separately. All right, so you'll see that the black piece, which is basically the bearing, so when you turn your wheels, there's something that helps it rotate up top. We're basically gonna have to get this piece and the whole strut kind of in this area, and then we'll be able to drop the strut mount out, and we're gonna take the spring out through the top actually. So right now what we're caught on is actually going to be the actual piston of the strut. We'll just have to find a way to push it down a little. We're gonna have to manually compress the strut a little. Takes a good amount of finger strength. Now that we kind of have it out of the way, you kind of get the idea of what's going on here. You can actually use the plier. Just make sure you're not gonna score up the center shaft. What I do is I will get a plier on the thread so you can come at an angle and you can kind of compress it down. Okay, now once we have it mostly cleared, we should be able to drop the 3 up top, and then we'll be able to get the strut mount out, and then we're gonna have to actually feed the bearing out, and we'll be able to rotate the spring out. This is 313 mils. So we got the mount out. Just pay attention, there's actually 2 ears. The upper strut bearing is actually gonna go in a certain way. Now we have the strut mount out. I'm actually gonna push this back in. The hard part is actually going to be compressing this strut once again and keeping it compressed so that we can clear the upper bearing and take out the upper bearing. You also want to be mindful of your wire, make sure you're not pinching it against the frame at any point. Bearing out, just keep in mind that the spring has to go on a certain way as well. Make sure you're bottomed out on that, especially when they're on the ears. Gotta throw it like that. You probably can't really throw it in the other way. Just pay attention. So now we have the two out. The spring should actually, we can just rotate it through the frame. Magic of circles. Extract the bellow, and then we're gonna be putting in brand new Techart springs. The fronts are actually gonna be thinner than the rear set. You can't really install these backwards. You know, a way to confirm is just to mash it up to the mount. The rears aren't gonna really fit in there. Special note, you're gonna wanna take out the stock bump stop. It's kind of like press fitted into the bellow. Should get undone, fall right out. Put in the new one. Fat end goes up. Should be held up on its own once it's properly installed. We're gonna slide the Techart spring in first. Careful of the wire. First couple coils should actually just drop right in. Then we'll start rotating it. Just be mindful of the wire, as always. So once that's slid in, we're just gonna wanna make sure that on the bottom mount over here, just like the top, where you have the spring going on a certain way, you want to make sure that the bottom of it meets the insulator the same way. After we've slid the spring through the frame and gotten it to rest on the lower perch, we're gonna want to throw the bellow and the bump stop on. The bump stop and the bellow will just slide through the top. We're gonna be back on board the struggle train. We're gonna have to get this on first. Also, before taking this out, I also paid attention to the orientation of these ears. You're gonna want the two ears to face towards the back of the vehicle. So the circular part is gonna face towards the front. And what we're gonna do is try to get the bearing on. We're basically just going to do the reverse of the removal. We're just gonna compress the strut piston down and slide this over the top of the spring. Make sure all the marks are lined up, and then we'll throw the strut mount in. Again, you have to be mindful of the wire here. Just make sure it's gonna pass through that bearing first. Man, we are so close. Okay, so now that we've cleared the upper bearing, we'll just line up the position. Everything is slid in place. We got one last piece to battle. Slide the strut mount back in. Careful not to pinch the wire. Want to be a little tight, but once we got the upper mount back in, throw our 313 millimeters back on. Now with this mount, you can basically install it, and this will actually give you different cambers. There's going to be marks from where it was previously mounted. Until the springs settle, the customer gets in alignment, we're just going to tighten it back up in the same spot. We'll do the final torquing at the end. This is just to hold it down in the meantime. Now that we have the mount back in, we're gonna have to recompress that strut piston. We're gonna guide the connector first through. Once you've guided the strut through with the wire coming up, all we have to be mindful of now is to line up this bearing plate. The two ears in the circle should go in easily. One last thing you'll want to double check is that the spring is still in the proper orientation within the two insulators. And once you're sure you're in the right spot, what we can do is take our floor jack again, go on the lower control arm. We're still seated. That will make the center nut come through. We'll throw the nut on, torque everything, go back down low, tighten up the sway bar link, and that would basically conclude the front springs. The other side is literally identical. It's a fairly straightforward process. Once we've got the center nut and the strut mount tightened down, all that's left to do up top is to reconnect the PASM connector. Very straightforward. Plug it in. Once that's all plugged in, we're just gonna throw the cover back on. The bottom two will slide in, and up top will clip in. Back to the bottom, we're gonna throw in our sway bar link. So this is actually recessed back to where it's supposed to be. Earlier, we saw that there was like a shade of black basically where the knuckle had fallen a little off the strut. But I think in our process, you're gonna wanna make sure that's all the way up. So what I like to do just to make fully sure, get the floor jack under it again, bring the weight of it up, and then we'll throw in our sway bar link, and then the job is basically done. To reiterate, it's gonna be an 18 millimeter nut, and most likely the sway bar link's gonna all spin with you, so I just counter hold it in the rear with a plier. Get it initially tight, and we'll torque it to spec, and then the front is basically done. So now we're gonna move over to the rear. Ralphie will actually take over the video on that. The rears are different from the front in the sense that we're gonna actually have to take out the whole strut and disassemble everything, and then put in the new spring, and then reinstall it back into the vehicle. Let's move on to the rear.
Okay, so we're gonna start off by taking the wheel. It's 5 19mm bolts. Just for peace of mind, I'm gonna use this wheel hanging tool that comes with a lot of spacer kits. It's designed to help slide the wheel out without damaging the caliper. So I'm just gonna thread this in real quick. Carefully take out the last lug nut. These European cars, they don't have studs, so the wheels tend to fall off and just start to wiggle it. And the benefit of this, normally where this would just drop and hit the caliper or damage the inside of the rim, it's a guiding pin, so you can slide it out past the caliper. All you gotta do is take it out. That's it. Essential. We're gonna start unbolting 3 control arms of the rear knuckle. It's gonna be this top one up here. We're gonna unbolt this side. There's a little fork underneath. We're gonna unbolt this one, and we're also gonna unbolt this one right here to help give the strut ease of access on its way out. So we'll start with the upper control arm. It's an 18. You don't have to unthread it by hand, I just do it. These control arms are usually under tension. Don't want it to snap up. This gives us some vertical and lateral play. Before we move any further, we want to make sure we disconnect the level sensor. Just a 10 mil nut, and you counter hold the other side of it with a 10 mil wrench. Easily forgettable, make sure you don't. It's at the base, it's towards the base of the upper control arms. Thread the nut back on, you don't want to lose it. Just let that hang on its own. So we're gonna move on to the lower control arm, the fork. 16mm socket on the head, and on the nut side, it's an 18mm. Always thread your nuts back into your bolts just so you know which one goes where. Now for the third lower control arm that we're loosening, it's gonna be a 21 on the head, 18 on the nut. This one's a little tricky just because of the tension. It's a little harder to get the actual bolt out, so you kind of just have to wiggle it. It came out relatively easy. Nut on the bolt, set it to the side. We have the actual strut, the bolt that actually holds the strut in. It's a pretty unusual shape. So we have a T45 to hold the head, and then the 27mm socket that we're gonna use to gun the axle of this off. It's a pretty weird shaped nut, but there's also a collar built into it, so it helps guide the bolt through. The bolt is actually under some tension, so never mind, it came out pretty easily. Again, the collar is built into the head of the bolt. So we're just gonna keep these together. Strut passes through here. So at this point, the strut is free. Beforehand, I was up top. You'll see later when we reinstall the 3 strut nuts, but the 3 strut nuts up top are 13mm. We've already undone those. We'll go over the location when it comes to reinstalling them. You have this wheel speed sensor right here that you just want to unplug and move out the way. You don't want to damage it. So at this point, we're just going to start wiggling the strut out. Slide it out of its perch. Okay, I'm going to lower the car a little bit. So like I said, everything's loose up top, but there is a lot of tension underneath these, so you're going to have to wiggle it out little by little. There it is. So as you can see, the 3 up top are just 3 13mm nuts. You have this this leveling sensor right here that you have to make sure you disconnect. We'll go over the location. Other than that, this is pretty much it. So now we're gonna move over to the spring compressor and transfer the springs over. It's very useful to have one of these. So you just wanna set the spring up and slowly start to compress it. Just take some of the tension off the top hat. And you can see that the strut, there's not much tension underneath it. We're gonna start working up top. You're gonna use a 9mm open-ended wrench to hold the center shaft of the strut, and then you're gonna use a 19mm wrench to undo the actual bolt. Here at the shop, we have these pass-through sockets that are designed to work with these situations. Basically, they have a cutout half of it's cut out just so you have access to hold the center shaft, like what we're about to do now. A regular 19mm wrench will suffice. It'll just take a little bit longer, but we're gonna use the socket. Just gonna pass the sensor through just so it can spin freely, and we're just gonna start working the nut off. Hold the center shaft so that the bolt can spin freely. Probably one of the more tedious parts of the installation, just because this pass-through socket doesn't allow you that great of range of motion, but it's better than none. Just gonna separate the entire strut assembly, but we're gonna try to keep a clear order of how everything's assembled. Just when it comes to reinstallation, it becomes that much more straightforward. The old spring, we can decompress this spring compressor, set this to the side, start to reassemble the new strut. So one of the benefits of having lowering springs is that you actually don't need a spring compressor because the actual height of the spring is less than that of the original. In terms of this application, that benefits us because we can just assemble it without using the spring compressor. So what we'll do is we will throw a spring over. You want to make sure this tapered edge seats to the bottom. It's a flatter surface as well. Just pass the wire through. There's no direction to observe on the bottom half of the strut, but there is one up top. So when you install the upper bushing, you want to make sure you orient the shape of it to match the top of the spring. Okay, get it to match. Make sure everything's lined up. Make sure the boot is properly covering the shaft. And this is where it being a lowering spring benefits us, is that I can just install the top half, install the bushing, and where normally I would have to compress the spring pneumatically, I can actually just physically press it down to get it to the point where the nut actually threads on. So we're just gonna push it down, get a few more threads. That's pretty much it. Tighten it down, and then it'd be ready for installation. The nut up top will get to a point where it starts to cause the shaft to spin with us. As you can see now, if I spin it slowly. So at this point, I use the 9mm wrench to hold it in place. And just a quick note, you have to use the open-ended side because the shape of the top of this center shaft here is not that of a full circle. It's more so, I don't even know how to describe it. A little bit extra turn, make sure that it's tight, and now we're ready for installation. You may find that you have to rotate the head of this strut just to properly fit into the actual shape of the body. It's not a perfect triangle, so just make note of it. If you do have to rotate it, that's fine. It spins freely. Like I said, there's no orientation on the bottom, so if you need to rotate it, it's not gonna hinder anything, so just feel free to do so if you run into that problem. This part's gonna be a little bit tricky just because now we're working against gravity, so we're just gonna slowly but surely just try to fish it through. Make sure it doesn't bind on anything, make sure it doesn't break anything, or we're gonna fish the actual harness end through the body so that it pokes out up top, and we're gonna continue to push the strut upward. Okay, so now slowly but surely we're gonna start aligning it with the rest of the control arms. The benefit of that, of removing all the control arms, is that the spindle, the position of it is actually, the hub is actually, you can manipulate it a little bit. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. Having a various assortment of pry bars might help you out in terms of leveraging things over so that you can work smarter, not necessarily harder. So at this point, we're gonna start trying to get the nut and bolt guided through its respective hole. The nut end portion faces the rear of the car, and the head, it faces the front of the car. So when you install it, make sure that you reinstall it the way it came out. So it seems like it's lining up just fine, so we're gonna go ahead and slowly thread it down. The nut side is a 27, the actual head of the bolt is a T55. Just gonna do it by hand and watch the bolt get sucked in, just to make sure that everything is as it seems. There we go. It's lining up, everything's lining up perfectly. We want to make sure to not tighten this all the way down, just because since these are bushings that are sitting inside of this control arm, we want to make sure we preload it to its factory setting just to prevent any premature wear on the bushing and just get those lined up. We don't want to line this one up just yet, because if we install this, then we have no access to the actual strut portion. This sits directly in front of it, so we're just gonna save this arm for the last part, and we're gonna move on to the other control arm. So we have this lower one right here, and we're gonna do the same process. There it is. All right, we're gonna move up top and get this upper arm also 90%. You just wanna press it down. This one's a little tricky though. You wanna make sure, because this is not just a nut and bolt, that it's just a nut and it doesn't have a guiding tip to it. You want to make sure 100% that this is lined up with the thread and it's threaded properly before you go to tighten it down, because since this entire suspension system is made out of aluminum, it's very easy to strip it out. So the way you do that is you carefully push the bolt through until that you feel that it's seated, and you just want to try to thread it in by hand. And closely watch the head of the bolt and make sure that it's sinking in with no effort. Once you can confirm that it's sinking in just by very easily, then you can confirm that at that point that it is lined up with the threads properly. So now we're gonna raise the car up and we're gonna begin the preloading process. So obviously having a lift helps, but you can do the same thing with jacks. All that we're doing is that we're putting load under the bushings to raise the suspension to try to mimic the way it would sit on even ground. So you'll see we're just gonna plant this in a position that we can access all three ends of the control arms without getting in the way of the bolts. And we're just gonna slowly put pressure. All right, once you've put sufficient load on it, then you can go ahead and tighten everything down. 21 side on the head, and it's an 18 on the nut side. The nut end of the lower end of the strut is a 27, a T55. And we can move on to the lower fork. Then you're gonna have to go ahead and preload this bushing by doing the same thing we just did. The head of this bolt is gonna be a 16 millimeter, and the nut end is gonna be an 18, so we're just gonna head and torque this down. We're gonna go ahead and any sensors that we disconnected or the lowering level, we're gonna reconnect that, replace everything back to its original positions, and then we'll move up top. So set this sensor right here, just gonna plug it back in, throw this grommet back in. Once that's tight, that's pretty much wraps up the majority of the installation. All that's left is to go to the interior and just tighten the 13 millimeter bolts down on both sides. That's it. So moving on to the interior of the car, the way this is set up, you have this tray, a very thick layer of fabric and cushion over the trunk. You're gonna wanna flip the interior seats down. You're gonna flip this up. This is usually tucked behind the seat, so you're gonna flip this up. There's no bolts or clips keeping it attached. It's just a matter of pressure, so you just lift it up and you're gonna expose this fuse panel and a couple of modules. You're gonna see all this. Up top is this foam insert that keeps everything from moving around. As you can see, everything's pretty loose in here. So this top half keeps everything pretty steady. So you're gonna want to, that pulls straight out. You might have to lift the rear end of it and just pull it out. Once you get these two pieces out of the way, you'll start to see here on the driver's side, we have the top of the strut. You have two up here, you have two studs exposed, and if you just move this harness out the way, you'll see the third one in the back. They're just 13 millimeter nuts. You're gonna thread those on by hand, and then you have a ratcheting wrench. Use it, get a deep-ended 13 socket. That's what we're gonna use. It's pretty cramped in here. Also, before you walk away, don't forget to re-plug the EDC harnesses together. It just clips in. Move that out the way so that we have access to work in. We're just gonna thread them by hand. One in the rear is gonna be the most annoying. You kind of just have to go by feel. For the sake of convenience, I'm gonna try to get this deep 13 in there. We'll see. We're gonna be moving on to the passenger side now. The process follows the same. Make sure the EDC harness is attached. You'll know it's plugged in because it'll clip, it'll make an audible click. That's pretty much all there is to it. You're just gonna put everything back as it was. You're gonna insert this foam tray up top. Wanna pass through one side at a time. It's fabric, so you can fold it, no problem. Tuck this behind the panels as it was. Flip this end up. Flip this end up. That's all there is to it.
Carrera 4S, son. He's already on 12mm spacers all around, so right now we have the wheel cut, but this is approximately the fitment that you'll get with these Techart springs. It'll probably settle a little more as well, so it should look a little nicer than this.